Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panellists, and I'm going to join them now. So I might pull this around a little bit. Now, Nick and Anthony, I think I might start initially with your experience, and then I'll come to you, Katja, when we're thinking about the opportunity here in Auckland. And wonder if I could start with you, Anthony. You've had experience in the US, but most recently in the Australian context with some of the major LRT initiatives over there. Can you maybe just start by outlining some of the projects that you've done and what you see to be the critical success factors?
Thanks, Stephen. Well, we'll start more presently and then work back. So more recently, I've worked on a couple of the extensions that are currently either underway or have been planned on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and then the Perth Max Light Rail project, which is sort of being repackaged at the moment now by the current WA government. The Gold Coast line light rail has turned out to be quite a good success in Queensland. It's been quite a good model that others are trying to replicate, especially on the Sunshine Coast now. And the Gold Coast has had a good deal of success because of its connections with the rest of the network, but also because the council has been very active in pushing the land use component next to all the stations, walkability. They recently uncapped the height limits on towers in certain parts of the city, particularly around the light rail corridor. So those were some of the key elements for its success as it sits. In the US, I worked on several lines in Houston, and which is quite similar to Auckland in the sense that it's very, very car dependent. But when the first line there opened, it was the top performing line per mile in the United States. And then we also had 3 lines that effectively opened at the same time in 2014. So those have all been successful because of partnerships, because of understanding the implications, and because of people, really.
Nick, you've seen the success of Gold Coast Light Rail.
Yep.
And Newcastle, Canberra's underway now. Sydney's not going quite so well. Maybe if you could throw some light on, why the great success, I guess, in Gold Coast versus where we've got to in Sydney.
Yep.
And yeah.
So I think first it's worth pointing out that in Australia over the last few years we've seen a lot of really good progress in the way that we think long-term and plan our infrastructure. The advent of the I-bodies and transport agencies publishing these sort of very forward-thinking, very strategic plans is actually coming through now through to good projects on the ground with projects like Gold Coast Light Rail, also in Canberra and Newcastle. But I guess there's been learnings from Sydney Light Rail. It's a very challenging project. It's before the courts now, so I can't get into too much detail about it. But I think what that project has shown in terms of risk is that the risk can't always be well defined, well assessed, well priced, well managed, or absorbed by the private sector. So I think we need to move to a more collaborative model where those risks are shared when they cannot be so well defined. I think in Gold Coast there were issues at the start, similar issues to Sydney as well, but they weren't as an extensive challenge, I think, to what they had in Sydney.
Thanks. I mean, you've got any comment on that, Anthony? I mean, you've seen them both.
Yes. Yeah. So sort of the issues were around just some of the technical details, but it was just sort of a nature of the project at the time, just information that was available. But they, sort of, again, I guess, partnerships and working together for common goals. I think, for myself, that's been an overarching theme, is common goals and partnership with people at different levels, and that's how they were able to push through.
Okay. Now, Katja, I'm going to come to you in a moment just around the development opportunity, obviously, that light rail presents, but maybe if we could have some observations from Nick and Anthony on that wider kind of urban regen. I mean, have we actually seen significant growth and density along the corridors? I guess that's kind of question number one, and related to that, how's the value creation, value capture story gone?
So in Melbourne, it's the world's largest and oldest network. I think it's underpinned, it's the backbone of that city. In some of the ones in Canberra, it's still quite early days, it's still under construction. One of the key objectives, though, is densification along that Northbourne Road corridor. I think there is interest there. It is also a regeneration from social housing stock. Newcastle, without a doubt, it'll be transformational. It's an old industrial city that has been revitalising, but by the brownfield redevelopment from heavy rail, which went right into the city, taking that out and putting a light rail in there, and we've started to see a lot of activity already. That one probably best for you to talk about Gold Coast.
Yeah, in the Gold Coast, I mentioned that the council has uncapped height limits and that sort of thing along all the light rail stations, especially in Surface Paradise and some of the more densely
So
populated areas.
when you say uncapped, it can go basically as high as...
It's as high
presumably
as
economic.
yeah, as high as the federal airline regulators will allow, effectively.
That's pretty high.
And look, the market has responded. There's been several proposals in the Gold Coast for towers well over 100 stories, 104, a couple of twin 108 story buildings. And I think the big thing with the council is very much on that interface at the ground level as well. So you're getting the densification and plenty of people that can fit into a certain footprint, but at the same time, that relation to the street is also there.
Yeah.
And that's a very key aspect. Some of the challenged ways that I've seen it be done in some American contexts is these towers and these very, what we want as far as density and more people in smaller areas. They've done that, but it's been sort of car parks right at stations,
Right.
so it's not quite the ideal outcome. But the Gold Coast has managed to pull that off quite well.
On value capture, though, second part of your question, in Australia, we've had these debates sort of for a long time now, how you use value capture. There's sort of different ends of the spectrum. You've got very optimistic, where you can fund the whole project. To the other end, where it's just another land tax. It's administratively expensive, don't worry. The reality could be somewhere in the middle, but by and large in Australia, historically and looking forward, a vast majority of our infrastructure will come through taxpayer dollars or user charges or other beneficiary charges, not through value capture. I don't think it's really a really proven model yet. It is occurring on things like City Metro, and there are some value capture mechanisms with Gold Coast, some proposed as well for Parramatta. But I don't think it's a proven model yet. There was a report released by Infrastructure Australia recently that said if you do want to look at value capture seriously, you need to reform the way that we tax land, move to a more broad-based tax system, and that's really politically challenging to do in Australia. The ACT's got a 20-year plan to shift to that sort of model, but I think right now for value capture, I don't think it's going to be taxpayer dollars. It's going to be user charges that's going to actually fund these projects.
That your view too as well, Anthony?
In the scope of value capture, so in the Gold Coast, as it's been mentioned a few times, so the Gold Coast, I was formerly an officer in their transport section at Gold Coast Council, and they have a transport levy that's effectively a flat charge on every property across the council.
Right, so John earlier in his presentation talked
Exactly,
about a sort of a curve, so
Yes.
the further out you pay
Yes.
less, but the closer you are, you pay more because you're getting more amenity.
I think
But they
ideally
didn't do that.
they don't do that. That's
Yeah.
right, and I think that they've found some issues with that. People who live
Not fair.
quite far away, they're wondering why are they paying this. But it's one that they used, I think, as a basis to then float a bit of debt to then provide their funding contribution to the project. So they, as a council, contributed part of the funding for stage 1 as well as for stage 2, and they are very, very keen on providing funding for stage 3 as well.
Okay.
And on that too, so there's also, I think one of the challenges of value capture too is that it's really hard to forecast or estimate the impact the infrastructure has on prices. On Gold Coast, I've seen various reports. One of them though, between 2007 and 2015, property prices fell about 4% in the Gold Coast. That was actually in line with the property price fall for for houses in that corridor. Mm-hmm. So they actually suffered, and they actually did suffer a higher price decrease. So there are some efficiency questions here when there isn't actually a value uplift at all, but yet they're still being charged a fee.
Yeah.
Great. Now that's a great segue because you've got an enormous, opportunity when you start to think about the development of the urban land development. In the case of HLC and working in partnership, obviously, with Housing New Zealand, with significant land ownership, I mean, that is a tremendous opportunity for value creation for the government and obviously a value capture opportunity. Is that how you're seeing it, Katja? Or?
I think, I mean, one of the things that we're really interested in is how the opportunity that we have from the redevelopment of Housing New Zealand, and combined with the light rail, combined with the enormous growth that Auckland is going through, is the key opportunity I see is for the value to those communities in terms of well-being benefits, where we can change those suburbs in a way that actually increases the livability, because we all know that the property development opportunity only comes from people wanting to live there. So it doesn't sort of arrive on its own. So, and the point I would make is that creating livable neighbourhoods is quite complex, it's quite fine-grained, and I think light rail is only one of many of the ingredients. Like it's quite complex, and if you think of, I suppose, your walkable journey from your home to your light rail to where you're wanting to go, as well as the opportunity to perhaps fix some of the suburbs that we have across Auckland through the change we are, imposing on those suburbs through light rail, through the regeneration of housing, is the huge opportunity of leaving them in a much better place where people can have much better lives.
So how are you thinking about, I know it's very early days, but I guess Fergus laid down the challenge before that we're kind of starting with the story about transit-oriented development and how we might do that. How are you thinking about that? Is it being, I see one of the questions coming through, and I would encourage people to keep adding the questions, although I have to confess my old age is not helping me. Being able to read the screen from here is a bit challenging, but one of the top questions up there was, are we thinking about the value creation, value capture opportunity in the business case, and how we're kind of thinking about really making this an economic project as well as a social project?
Yeah, I suppose, it's probably too early to talk about the business case and how that's coming together, but I think it's fair to say that it looks at all those factors. Clearly there's economic benefits to Auckland from this project, and there's well-being benefits to the individuals, and I think the million-dollar question is how do you capture some of that? The point I would make is that I think it's also important, as well as talking about value capture, is to talk about what light rail as a catalyst might make feasible that otherwise wouldn't be feasible, that actually gives us the outcome that we want as a city. To give an example, in the areas of Mount Roskill and Mangere, at the moment, making apartments viable is quite hard because there isn't really a ready market for apartments. So the presence of light rail might simply mean that we can see apartments occurring earlier in communities where perhaps otherwise we might have seen lower density development. And the flow on from that is more bums on the seats for the light rail, which is great for the light rail, but also more people being able to live in communities where they're really well connected to employment and education, and the economic benefit that has to Auckland as a city. And I think especially if we're thinking of communities such as Mangere, where through regeneration and densification, you can really see a difference to those people's lives, and where we, through denser development, can create more affordable housing, more social housing, a better connected community. I suppose what I'm sort of voicing is I think we can get distracted by the value capture argument, and we can lose sight of why we're actually doing this.
Yes, and it's not actually about driving dollars, although hopefully that's a dividend, but actually you want to create a great community, don't you? That's what it's about. Yeah.
Indeed.
And I think the point I would make is I think the last thing we want to do through value capture is to actually set an incentive that results in a type of development we don't actually want to see.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be careful that we still get the outcome we want.
So the government has a very strong focus on well-being and getting a triple bottom line outcome. If you were to describe what success looks like from your point of view, Katja, maybe walk me through what the community will look like. What sort of amenity will I see? And give me a feel for what it's going to be like. in your ideal world? I appreciate this is early days, but
Yeah.
you start with a vision, don't you?
Yeah, you do, and I think one thing we sometimes talk about is that we obviously are in the business of land development and building houses together with Housing New Zealand and the private sector, that in many ways doing the civil works and constructing the houses, while it's messy and it's complex, we know how to do that. So in a way, that's the easy bit. It's the bits in between that are hard. It's the ensuring that the amenity comes with the houses, that the community is strengthened rather than weakened through what we do. So I think what success looks like is communities that, where people can have great lives, where they can have access to the great things that Auckland has to offer. And that includes all the opportunities around employment, around education, around recreation, around culture, and having that accessible to everybody in a reliable, inexpensive way, I think is a really important part of the quality of life of those suburbs. And I think if you lay over the top of that the quality of urban amenity that can flow from light rail, and I think some of the pictures that Fergus was showing, and I think all of us love cities that have light rail. It's just something about light rail. So if this can be a catalyst to give people sort of a sense of pride in where they live and a real quality of amenity that currently doesn't exist, then I think, to me, that's what success looks like.
Anthony, from your experience, I mean, has that kind of vision been delivered, or is there more that we can do, and if so, what might that be?
Well, I think that the dialogue that I've heard today and just, over the last few days around it, I would, no pun intended, say that you're right on the right track as far as that, and in some cases, I think that the arguments or the debates that are being held now were debates that others had to arrive at. So I think that the dialogue, especially with HLC in position to be in to generate and deliver community outcomes, I think are very positive. And you're right about what light rail could generate towards that vision. In Houston, we actually had empirical data that proved that 37% of people used the system just because it was light rail. There was buses that was there initially, but they moved to light rail. They didn't use bus, they used light rail almost 2 out of every 5 because it had that sense to it. And it can't always put the finger on it, but it's almost like community as well, that sense to it. And I think that being able to deliver that, I think, you're on the right way.
Nick, your experience, I mean, it's kind of looking back, and you've seen what's been delivered in Australia to date. Has that delivered that vision of transit-oriented development, great communities? Is it seen as success by the communities where it's been delivered?
I think for the project we're saying to deliver now, I think it's still too early to tell.
Yeah.
I think there is a generally accepted perception that Gold Coast, which is the most probably progressed, is the most successful. There is light rail in Adelaide as well. That's also, I think, the perception there is quite successful too. But I think everyone's. I think the marker that in places like Newcastle, where they are building it right now, and you start to see that development already coming into the area, is a good signal that you're on the right track.
Yeah.
But just on your point though about the way that we scope what the projects are, and I think it's a really important point you made about not letting things like value capture potentially drive what the actual project is. The project should be about defining what the actual, the way I think about scoping projects is what's the actual challenge. I think it's easy to get caught up in that sort of nice feel about light rail, that it can solve all your urban congestion issues. I think we need to think about what's the challenge. Is it urban activation or is it urban congestion? And then you start to think about your options after that. And then also opposed to having, what might be best to make the project most affordable, cheap for government, might not actually be best for what is for the community.
When we were in the United States, one of the primary reasons for going was to have a look at particularly in Portland, the success of transit-oriented development around the light rail corridors. The thing that really struck us, I guess more than just that story, was the ability of the political leaders and indeed the bureaucrats that were leading the projects to tell a compelling story about what they were seeking to deliver. And I'm just wondering, kind of how do we do that? Because there'll be people in the community who, and particularly retailers down Dominion Road, I'll cite that as an example. I mean, we've already seen some of the shots across the bows in the media to date who say, well, it's just going to ruin our business while this thing's constructed, and actually we need the car park so that people come and shop in our shops. And then people a little bit further back say, well, I'm never going to use it, but my rates are going to go up. So there's a real challenge, isn't there, about bringing the community along and actually selling the stories so that they actually see that they own the outcome, they own things. Thoughts on that? I mean, that's a big question, I know, but it's an important one.
I think, if I might start, I think something that we don't do well at the moment is communicate the huge benefits that come from density. I mean, Auckland is a city that struggles with making the things that we love viable, and I think we haven't been very good at sort of explaining that more density means more people means more good things like cafes and shops that are viable and public transport that are viable, and I think that includes the benefits to local retailers of actually having more people living within their catchment. And if light rail is one of those things that catalyses more people living closer to those stops, then I think you're starting to actually tell quite a compelling story. I mean, one of my colleagues described light rail or trams as pedestrian fountains. So if you make sure that those pedestrians are spilled in a location where they walk past all the shops on their way home, then that should have a really good flow and effect. And I think what we're struggling with in Auckland is that we are still lacking the examples for people to really understand that.
Two short things. One, I think engagement is one of the lessons that we learned in the U.S., partly because it's mandated, but the engagement with the individual actually can be quite rewarding. It can be thorny to begin with, but once you get people, especially in these communities, who really understand the purpose, and then they actually start becoming your local champions almost on the behalf of the project and start to translate or start to provide that message back amongst all their neighbors. I mean, it's one thing to speak with us who come from an office somewhere, but if the neighbor down the street who's always at the same shop as everybody else is saying the same message, it has a different stick to it and this to it. So that's the one thing. And the other is that you're right on density. In Houston, which is the biggest city in the world with no land use zoning, density was a bad word. But now, alongside the light rail lines particularly, there has been quite a huge change in densification. And it's become quite an attractive place to live. The market rents they rival some places in Australia and even here now, which is substantially different from what it was even 5 years ago.
I'll make just 2 points. Is this on? Oh, yeah. My first point about having long-term vision and planning, that is a really useful tool to bring the community along with you. And I know as industry in the room here, we love certainty of pipeline, and it does give that kind of an evidence-based sort of plan to move forward with. What it also does is that it can depoliticize projects, and that gives confidence to the community that the right projects are being built. Right now we're heading into an election in Victoria, and we're seeing pretty much, besides a few changes on the sides, bipartisan support for the project pipeline. And that's credit to what the organisations like Infrastructure Victoria and the Transport Agency have done. And so it gives, confidence to the community that these are the right projects. When things don't go so well, though, I think that's the real test to industry and to the public servants delivering it. I think Sydney's a good example now where there's been delays, and that doesn't serve anyone's interests. It's just going to escalate the costs even more, and it delays the benefits to the community. So you've got the busiest street in Australia, I would say, in George Street in Sydney, which is all closed off. They're opening parts of it now, and businesses in the community are getting frustrated. And it's added on to the fact that Sydney is a giant construction site. There's metro being built, there's big buildings being brought down, so the community is suffering from construction fatigue. So it's really important that industry and government, when things don't go well, they are project-focused, outcomes-focused, and they just get on with the job and deal with anything else that needs to be dealt with afterwards.
I mean, actually, when the project is delivered and people look back on it, they'll say, actually, that was really good.
Yep.
But they go through all of this pain, and I'm sure, I mean, Sydney's experienced the issues with the utilities and how that's managed, but once that's delivered, I think that will quickly fade, I suspect, provided the outcome is a great outcome. And, that ultimately comes down to the success of all of the parties working together to deliver that outcome. I'm going to go to Slido now because it's a question that's been sitting up there burning away for quite a wee while. I don't know if the panel can see it, but I think I've managed to finally get my eyesight working to the extent, and it may be a tough question, particularly for our Australian friends, but I guess it poses that fundamental question. We're doing a business case. Have we already made up our minds what the answer is? Because the question poses, if it is really about urban regeneration, will we actually do a business case that compares maybe the role that bus might have played, or heavy rail, and truly considered a multimodal? Katja, you're the closest to it. I know it's a really tough question, but if we're going to do justice to our proper business case there, and we are truly thinking of all transport modes, will it be on the table, do you think?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to talk to it. I'm sort of looking at Fergus, wondering if he wants to jump in, because considering that it's NZTA that's leading the business case rather than us, it's probably more appropriate for him.
Fergus. We'll put you on the spot, Fergus, but I think it's and apologies for doing so, but I think it's an important question about the robustness of the business case.
So look, the business case will look at what is the best mode for the corridor, but particularly in terms of creating the right outcomes. So what is the best way to get the urban development and land transport outcomes in this corridor? And in fact, that's one of the reasons, of course, why light rail has a big advantage.
The other question that's been sitting there burning away, and Fergus, this may actually be one for you as well, because it's kind of at the other end of the spectrum, which asks the question, how can we actually practically get on with the job? And how can we accelerate the progress to meet the timetable?
Oh, well, I think, firstly, we have an accelerator process. So what we're doing is we're accelerating the City to Mangere project and taking that out ahead, and actually focused on, and that's where Katja's team focused in their efforts, and our team are. So we're seeking to get that project up and ready as fast as we can. One of the things, of course, is that historically these projects have a certain time frame you have to work through. So we have to balance out making sure we actually do all the work and before we actually move to the next step. So look, what we're doing is we're going as fast as possible, asking the industry for what innovative ideas they have, but also making sure that we don't make the mistakes that have been made in other places. Because generally the experience shows you the best way to muck these projects up is to go too fast.
Yeah.
We know that the Sydney example, despite the fact that people say they can't talk about it in court, is because that a whole lot of things weren't done before the contract was entered into. So we're not going to make that mistake. So we won't be getting ourselves in that position. But we are trying to move through as many things as we can in parallel. But also right now, for people that are in industry here, is we are really looking for, are there ways to actually accelerate?
Thanks very much, and apologies for putting you on the stage there, Fergus, unexpectedly. But these are burning questions, obviously sitting in the audience. I can't cover them all because I've only got a minute 43 seconds counting down left. But I think Fergus touched on the procurement thing, and perhaps Nick, if I can just turn to you. Private capital has been instrumental in delivering the projects to date through PPP models. Yep. Success?
Yeah, I think Gold Coast is evidence of success. So they just, she pointed out side a bit, they just finished stage 2, which connects the isolated line to the broader network. I think it was the first time in Australia where they've had an extension operating PPP. And it was a very complicated structure there to deal with there during that operating environment, and they did it successfully before time for the Commonwealth Games and also under budget. So I think it's like a
pretty good outcome.
A really good outcome.
Yeah. And is that, in your experience, Anthony, is that the way to bring capability to the table?
I think it is. It's just a matter of especially if you've got it already in place in the case of what the Gold Coast had, and then the networks that have been established or ability to readily reach capabilities and then to deliver under tight time frames. It can't be overstated what they were working with as far as a tight time frame, but they managed to deliver well. Actually, they delivered early. They delivered earlier than they were supposed to, that one.
And I mean, just turn that question around the other way. I mean, the utilities, the issues around risks and managing those sorts of things, other forms of contracting arguably help walk through some of those risks. So should those be considered seriously in the Auckland context as well?
I would say that they should, for a couple of reasons. One, because of your social license being affected by it, but the other because of just the timing. If it's not necessarily coordinated well enough, there could be other risks with timing and other things contractually. So I think that those definitely need to be boxes ticked.
Yeah, I think, consider all options. But I think, the benefit of New Zealand is that you've got 8 test beds in Australia, and you can take and learn from what's worked there. So I think take what we've done in Australia with some of the projects that haven't gone so well and sort of look at how you can, as I said earlier, what are the risks you can't define, and actually work collaboratively to actually, I think, share those risks more appropriately, because the private sector can't hold all of them. So I think PPPs are still a live option, but you might have to tweak some of the edges or something, or the upfront.
Katja, any last thoughts, last word? What would you like to see?
Well, I'm just glancing at the
okay.
kind of live voting, so I might just make some comments in relation to that if I could. So really interested by people's views that there seems to be a perception that light rail might have a negative impact on affordability. I'm slightly puzzled by that, and I think I might come back to my earlier comments around the benefits of density, because what in the absence of loads of funding to make housing more affordable, the best thing we can do is build smaller homes. And the only way we can do that efficiently is if we're building at higher density. And if light rail can be part of making denser developments viable, then it will automatically drive affordability. So in addition to, I suppose, what we're doing in our projects in Mangere and Mount Roskill, where we're building around 20,000 new homes, and roughly about a third of them will be at more affordable price points. That is largely done through building smaller homes, and the most successful that we'll be at that is if we can get the densities up. So in my view, the light rail catalysing density will drive affordability in these suburban areas.
It is interesting looking at the poll as it's coming up. I see we've had 77. I'd love to see quite a few more people giving their response, because I guess we start, if that's the kind of prevailing view, then we have quite a considerable storytelling exercise to do, don't we? There's some pretty, although I'd have to say you've managed to swing it back 2% already, Katja, so well done.
I mean, the other point I would make, just to leading on from that, is that I think when we're talking about affordable housing, we need to look at more than just the cost of the house. So it's the cost of living in that location. So, and I think the real benefit comes in is if you can get to the point where, as a family, you run one car lease. So you then have less to spend on the car, but you also don't have to buy the car park, which is a huge expense. So it costs about 20 grand to provide a car park. So if you don't have to do that, I think we're really seeing some change.
There is another poll that's going to come up shortly, because there's 2 really key questions. Light rail has been sold by some of our politicians as being an answer to congestion. Be interested in your views. And you can see them coming up there now pretty quickly. That's actually quite a different story, isn't it, to the affordability question? And I suppose if you start with a section that already costs you a lot of money, it's pretty hard to deliver affordability. So your density is really the only way to kind of break through that challenge, isn't it? Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of our time. In fact, slightly, I've got a reputation for running over, and we're 4 minutes over, but I think it's been a fantastic discussion and learnings from both Australia, but also the opportunity presented now in Auckland. And I think the big challenge for us all, if we're going to make a success of this, is to be clear about our vision, tell a compelling story, and actually really demonstrate the benefits to bring Aucklanders along the journey with us. And we've got some challenges there according to the poll, so let's see if we can turn that around. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel, Katja, Nick and Anthony. Thank you.